There are a lot of legendary stories in modern culture that have been carried out in a series. Star Wars, The Hunger Games, Twilight. All of those are undoubtedly deserving of a sequel because the story was too long or too rich to tell in a single story. On the other side of that coin, some stories just weren't plain thought out well enough, or there was some kind of disconnect that made them flop with audiences. The Matrix trilogy is the first that comes to mind. So, what is that magic that makes a series worth sticking through, book after book, or movie after movie? Let's talk about that. Before we get into that, though, I told myself I wasn't going to be weird this week, that I would just ask you to hit the like and subscribe below and help me out, plus you'd get to hear about when I release a new video. But I can't do that. I'm recording this without pants on. If you've been following me for a while, you're probably wondering why I'd point to The Matrix as the single greatest hero's journey story of the modern era, and also refer to the sequels as a dumpster fire. This is probably a good first example of what not to do when crafting a sequel. It was only a 4-year span of time between The Matrix and The Matrix Reloaded. However, in that time, the writers had undergone a lot of changes in their personal lives, most particularly their bank accounts. Instead of holding off on writing a sequel before they could get their headspace back to where they were when they wrote The Matrix, they instead made The Matrix bend and change to them. So, the entire aesthetic shifted. Neo no longer was dressed in tactical gear, but this sort of samurai kimono meets trench coat. And the leather and vinyl-clad Trinity's clothing style was extended to basically every female character, who now looked more like they were wearing fetish gear. Which also brings up another point. Sexuality plays a much, much larger role in the sequels, which is weird, given the almost fairy tale prophesized love between Neo and Trinity in the first one. Now, I'm no prude, but it was enough of a departure from the tone of the original film that it just felt weird and out of place. So, here's what we don't do with sequels. Change the pace, tone, and mood to fit your current state of mind. I can actually speak to this one from experience. While writing The Unwinding Clock, the final book in the Incursion trilogy, I lost my dad. My head wasn't in this book at all, and if I tried to force it, it would have been a disaster. So, even though it was the final sequel of a series, and I already knew what happened, all of that, I couldn't write it in the headspace that I was in when I started the trilogy. So, I went ahead and I wrote In Shadows, a horror novel where grief and loss are the primary themes. This let me get my feelings of the moment out, and once I'd healed, I found myself in the headspace again where I could live in that Incursion trilogy world and write in a way that was consistent with the first 2 books. Sequels are a weird animal because they're not always warranted. So, what are some of the ways that we as storytellers can tell when a sequel's deserved? The first most obvious reason is that you've created not only a world, but a storyline that needs multiple volumes to tell. This is actually harder than you think. When I wrote the Dragon's Dream saga, did I know it would take 8 books? Yes. And boy, was that unsettling information. The real trick to this kind of undertaking is juggling the information that belongs as part of the overarching story and what you need to tell a satisfying current volume. For that, let's look at one of the greatest trilogies in movies, Back to the Future. You can most definitely argue Back to the Future 1 and 2 had cliffhanger endings, but honestly, the difference between them was almost 4 years. There was a period of time where people wondered if it was ever going to have a sequel, and just enjoyed the movie for what it was. If you watch that original movie again with that thought in mind, it works just fine as a self-contained story with an ending that makes you wonder, what if? Marty's mission to get back to the future succeeds. The story could end right there. Honestly, the same is true of The Matrix and Twilight. All of these films have a setup for a sequel in the ending, but none of them had to have it. You want to strive to make sure each chapter of your series is a self-contained story that, if read from start to finish, tells a complete story. So let's talk about 2 key pitfalls we need to avoid when telling that self-contained story, and that's retconning and undoing your climax. Let's start with retconning. What is that? Retconning, which is short for retroactive continuity, is where your sequel story revises or alters the premise of the original story in order to fit the new story the sequel's trying to tell. Now, we get a very exaggerated format of this in the Evil Dead trilogy. The intro to Evil Dead 2 is a recap of the events of the first movie, including a bunch of scenes that literally never happened. This is done for comedic effect, and in that regard, it works very well. Now, let's look at when it doesn't. The Star Wars sequel trilogy. One of the most damning parts of this trilogy is enormous retconning of the events of The Last Jedi. Last Jedi was written and directed by a completely different person than The Force Awakens. In that film, there were a number of dangling plot threads, not the least of which revolved around the main character Rey's heritage. Now, any sane person would see these threads and pick them up and dangle them for the third and final installment, but not Rian Johnson. He made it so that her parents were nobodies, maybe farmers somewhere. Not only is this a horrendous handling of the torch that was passed to him as a writer, but it also defies the concept of the auspicious birth portion of the hero's journey. Whether you're talking about our ancient bros using the son of a god, like our Egyptian friends in the mythology of Horus and Set, or the boy who lived, or the orphan raised by his aunt and uncle on Tatooine, you see what I'm getting at here? Now, it's one thing for a buffoon to take the reins and butcher a story, but what happened next? Well, the movie tanked. They brought J.J. Abrams back in to try and right the ship, and what does he do? Immediately retcon Rey back to an auspicious birth, because she's the granddaughter of the dead Emperor Palpatine who is now very much alive. Ugh. Short version is, retconning is gross and don't do it. How do we avoid it? Well, proper planning takes care of that pretty easily. Do you think I started writing an 8-book series without knowing what would happen in book 6? Of course not. These kind of multi-volume episodic stories are huge undertakings. You can't fly by the seat of your pants and just wing the last half. That's crazy. The Star Wars sequels is a perfect example of why you never do that. The second pitfall is along the same lines as retconning, but I'd say it's a little worse. Setting your stage for a sequel is fine, and we all do it, but be very careful that your setup doesn't undo the events of your climax. How do I mean? Well, for that, let's go way back in time and take a look at Masters of the Universe. The first attempt to put the character He-Man on the big screen did pretty well, despite how baffling and poorly it was handled. The worst offense comes after the credits roll. In the climax, He-Man battles his nemesis Skeletor and tosses him down a pit. One dead bad guy. After the credits roll, Skeletor emerges from the liquid they keep at the bottom of bottomless pits and warns the audience, "I'll be back." So the climatic battle wasn't really a climax at all. There was no decisive win here. That's like having a boxing movie where our hero is winning and then his nemesis falls out of the ring and we just end the movie. No winner, the match isn't over yet, but we're done here. I'm not even using a metaphor here. If the fall didn't kill Skeletor and he still wants to fight, then all that really happened was he fell in the middle of the fight. How do we avoid things like this? Well, mercifully, this is a much easier problem to solve. Don't bait and switch the audience. Understand that in a long series, both your protagonist and your antagonist are going to have victories. How complete do you want those victories to be? Does Vader get to take a hand off? Well, that's crippling in a world where Luke would have to just live with that. But it's more like a bummer when you can just go get a new robot hand. Good thing that loss didn't have any lasting consequences, right? Sometimes the victory is a moral one. Look at The Dark Knight and compare it to the original Michael Keaton Batman. In the Michael Keaton Batman, Joker dies pretty definitively at the end. You really want to take a performance like Jack Nicholson and a villain like the Joker and make them permanently dead in your world? Okay, go ahead, I guess, but it's a bad idea. In The Dark Knight, Batman doesn't want to kill the Joker, but he can't let the Joker enact his plan. So he goes to extremes to make sure that the Joker's plan fails. Now Joker is in jail until he breaks out, and we do this all over again. Again, I have experience with this. In Book 3 of the Dragon's Dream saga, a long-awaited physical showdown happens between our main character and her antagonist. It only takes enough to show that she can harm the dragon, a single wound, to force him to flee and end the fight. Getting that one shot in takes the entire chapter. What I'm saying is, don't overdo it. If you don't want to kill the antagonist, then why are you making it seem like they died in the battle? There are better ways to show stakes and end stories. Now, while I mentioned The Matrix as an example of when a sequel feels like it doesn't slot in after the first movie, I'd again point to Back to the Future Part 2 to see what it looks like when it's done correctly. To hop back into these characters, 4 years later, the writing and acting is pretty seamless, even if some of the actors have been replaced. This film picks up seconds from where the last one left off, but feels tonally almost the exact same as the first film, while having a completely different plot. That last bit is also really, really important. citing The Force Awakens as a truly bad example, because it feels like a Temu knockoff of the plot to Star Wars Episode 4, we can't rehash our story 3 times over and call it a trilogy. We need to bring in something new to the table. Also, why the heck are trilogies the most common form of multi-episode storytelling? Well, I'm glad you asked. The trilogy is actually a larger version of what we've discussed numerous times on this channel. That is, the classic 3-act structure. In the first act, we have rising action and the first major trial of our hero, in which they succeed in the climax. In the second act, we raise the stakes, rising action even bigger than the last, but oh no, Act 2 is where the drop happens, where all hope is lost. Now, this has probably happened in each of the books to one extent or another, but the second book in a trilogy will typically have a drop so significant that it puts the whole story in jeopardy. Again, we have to point to Empire Strikes Back and Back to the Future Part 2. These are 2 sequels that do everything exactly how you're supposed to. They raise the stakes over the first one, then they have a drop that puts the whole story in jeopardy. It shouldn't come as much of a surprise that these sequels are often regarded by fans as even better than the first. If you hold these films on a pedestal and keep them as an example of a Part 2 done perfectly, it's very unlikely that you'll screw up on such a colossal level like The Last Jedi. Now, the real trick is sticking the landing. Part 3 of a trilogy, or any final book in a series, has to manage triple duty. It has to be a story on its own, it has to have greater rising action than any part that came before it, and this is your last chance to tie up every subplot and loose thread, ending the series with nothing left unsaid. That is a mouthful. Having done it twice now, I can tell you that trilogies are easier to manage than large multi-book series. Over the course of the Dragon's Dream saga, I had a rotating cast of side characters, at one point numbering 20, that I needed to keep track of. Some of their stories end in death, some simply go away to parts unknown, and in all honesty, I've often felt like I needed even more wrap-up than I had. We're not talking about like Return of the King with its 14 false endings, but tying up every thread with more finality for side characters. Is it necessary? No, but we're all supposed to be our greatest critics, right? For example, Back to the Future is one of my favorite trilogies of all time. The number of times I've watched it is ridiculous. Do I feel that the third one perfectly wraps up the series? Well, yes and no. The idea that Doc realized the dangers of the time machine and wanted it destroyed is largely undercut by making a flying time train just to wave goodbye to Marty. If anything, I feel like Doc should have left him a note in the Old West, knowing that he'd get it, and letting Marty know that he was free of the predetermination that the future is what he makes of it. Same message as the ending, but more honest to Doc's character. The thing is, that's kind of a downer. It's a bittersweet ending, knowing that Doc is long dead, having lived out a happy life in the Old West and taken the secret of time travel to his grave. But, given the alternative of a flying train, I think I would have rathered bittersweet over fantastical. That little aside there, though, that's the beating heart to answer your question about crafting a long-form series. You need to ask yourself the critical questions. Why does this need to be so many volumes? Do you have a unique story to tell from start to finish in every part? Is there a larger story told across the many volumes that is wrapped up in the conclusion? Does the rising action increase in each and every volume? Is there a big drop where all hope is lost? Does the final story wrap up both the story it's telling and the larger story? This is sort of a checklist, for sure, but if you can't answer all of these questions, you're probably not ready for the undertaking just yet. But, as you can imagine, if you can answer all these questions, my friend, consider this the green light. You're good to go. May you spawn wildly successful sequels. Sequels are more of what we love, and sometimes familiarity breeds contempt. See Star Wars for that. One of the largest IPs in the world. Can't even get its own fans to stop killing each other over which project they hate the most. Solid writing fixes so many of these problems that we see these big studios going through right now, but they keep throwing money at the problem instead of talent. Maybe someone listening out there can be the change we all so badly need. So don't forget to check out my author page. The link is in the description below. You'll also find the link to my newsletter in the comments where you can get a free book, read about all my latest projects, and find other indie authors for your next great read. Don't forget to like and subscribe to hear about new videos, and as always, have fun and get crafting.